The old ranch sat at the far edge of Dry Creek, a place where the earth turned from gold to gray, and the sky always seemed one shade too heavy. Jed Turner arrived with little more than a suitcase, a saddlebag of debts, and the deed to the land that had belonged to his late uncle. The house greeted him with silence, the kind that feels like someone just stopped talking. He walked the length of the porch, boards bending under his boots, and pushed open the door. The air inside smelled of cedar, dust, and something faintly metallic. Everything was just as his uncle had left it. A few chairs, a rifle mounted above the hearth, shelves crowded with old ranch ledgers. It wasn't until he entered the parlor that he noticed the table. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, a squat oak table, scarred by years of use. But sitting squarely in its center was a wooden box, covered by a black cloth. The fabric looked older than the house itself, its edges frayed, the threads stiff with age. Jed crouched beside it, curiosity tugging at him. The box was small, about the size of a loaf of bread. The cloth's corners were tucked neatly underneath, as though someone had been determined to seal it in darkness. He reached out, then stopped. There was something about it, a weight in the air, or maybe just the sense that it was meant to stay covered. He stood and told himself it didn't matter. Whatever was in the box, it belonged to the past, and the past had already taken enough from him. Still, he couldn't stop glancing back at it as he unpacked. Later that afternoon, Martha Riggs came by. She was his nearest neighbor, though that meant she lived a full mile down the dusty road. Her hair was white as prairie snow, her skin weathered by decades of sun, and she carried a still, warm pie in both hands. "Your uncle was a good man," she said when Jed invited her in. "Didn't talk much, but he cared for this place. Shame what happened." Jed offered her a chair, and they talked about fences, water rights, and the drought that wouldn't quit. But Martha's words slowed when her gaze drifted to the parlor. "What's that?" she asked quietly. Jed followed her eyes. "Just a box he left behind. Haven't opened it yet." She didn't move, didn't blink. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "You didn't touch it, did you?" "No, ma'am." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "Then don't. You hear me, Jed Turner. Whatever's under that cloth, it's not for you. Your uncle made me promise never to lay eyes on it again, and I mean to keep that promise." Jed frowned. "What's in it? Money, something dangerous, dangerous," she whispered. "But not the way you think." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "He told me once that the thing inside was older than this land, older than any of us. It's best left in the dark." She left so quickly, she forgot the pie on the counter. Jed called after her, but she didn't turn back. He watched her retreat down the road until the dust swallowed her whole. That night, as the wind came down from the hills, the house began to creak and sigh like a tired animal. Jed couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that black cloth and heard Martha's trembling voice, "Don't take it off." The lantern on his bedside table flickered once, then twice. Somewhere in the parlor, something tapped faintly once, twice, then again, a slow and steady rhythm, as though someone were drumming their fingers on wood. Jed sat up, heart pounding. The sound stopped. It was probably nothing, an old house settling, maybe a loose shutter, but he knew exactly where it had come from, the parlor, the table, the box. He pulled the blanket higher and tried not to listen as the wind whispered along the walls, carrying a single, broken phrase through the night. "Leave it, covered." Jed lasted 2 more nights before the whisper of curiosity grew too loud to ignore. During the day, he tried to stay busy, fixing the corral fence, clearing tumbleweed from the porch. But every hammer strike and every gust of wind seemed to echo from the parlor. The house was alive with small sounds, and each one pointed back to that single, shrouded shape on the table. By the 3rd evening, the unease had turned into something heavier. The air felt wrong, too still, too expectant. He built a fire in the hearth and poured himself a drink, hoping the heat and the whiskey would drown whatever nonsense Martha Riggs had planted in his mind. But when the clock ticked past midnight, he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. 3 steady beats, soft and deliberate, coming from the parlor. Jed froze. The fire popped, the only other sound in the room. Then it came again. Closer, clearer. It wasn't mice. It wasn't the wind. It was something inside the house. He grabbed his lantern, its flame trembling like his hand, and made his way toward the sound. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, every step echoing as though the walls were hollow. When he reached the parlor doorway, he stopped. The black cloth was shifting, not much, just a faint ripple, as though a draft had passed beneath it. But the windows were shut tight, and the air was still. The tapping ceased the instant he stepped into the room. The silence that followed was thick enough to press against his ribs. Jed swallowed. All right, he muttered, voice low, enough of this. He set the lantern down beside the table. The flame wavered, casting long, bent shadows across the walls. The box was small, harmless. The cloth looked no different than any other scrap of fabric. Dusty, dull, ordinary. And yet his pulse thundered like a stampede. He reached for it once, hesitated, then snatched his hand back. The air felt colder near the box. He could see his breath, faint and white, drifting above it. This is ridiculous, he told himself. It's just a box, a silly superstition. He gripped the edge of the cloth. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, with one swift motion, he pulled it away. The lantern light caught something underneath, something that shimmered faintly, like a pond disturbed by wind. It was a mirror. Small, oval, its frame carved from dark wood so black it seemed to swallow the light. The surface wasn't quite glass. It had depth, a slow ripple that never stilled. Jed leaned closer. His own reflection wavered in the strange surface, warped by that movement. His features swam, twisted, and came back into shape. He exhaled shakily and ran a finger along the frame. It was warm, though the air around him had turned to ice. The tapping had stopped completely. The only sound now was the faint hiss of the lantern. He told himself to laugh, to scoff, to feel relief. But the feeling wouldn't come. There was a weight behind the glass, a sense of presence. And then his reflection blinked. Not slow, not sleepy, a quick, deliberate blink while his own eyes were wide open. Jed stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a chair. The lantern rocked, throwing shadows like claws across the ceiling. The reflection didn't move again, but it watched him. He could feel its gaze pressing against him from inside the mirror, calm and patient. For a long moment he couldn't breathe. Then, from somewhere deep inside the glass, a faint whisper rose, a voice, rough with distance and cold. "Thank you." The flame in the lantern flickered violently. Jed snatched the cloth and tried to cover the mirror again, but the fabric slipped from his hands, heavy and slick with sudden moisture. He froze. The mirror pulsed once, like a heartbeat. The voice came again, clearer now, still soft. "You shouldn't have looked." Jed stumbled from the room, slamming the door behind him. His pulse thudded in his ears, and he didn't stop running until he was in the barn, breath clouding in the dark. From the house across the yard came the faintest echo of a sound, low and steady, tap, tap, tap against the window pane. Something was inside now, and it wasn't him. At first light, the wind came hard off the plains, stirring dust across the porch and moaning through the dry grass. Martha Riggs saw the front door of the Turner Ranch swinging open when she crested the rise on her morning walk. That door had never hung loose before. Jed might have been new to ranch life, but he was careful, too careful to leave it open overnight. She called out his name once, then again, louder. The only answer was the groan of the hinges and the rustle of tumbleweed skittering across the yard. She hesitated before stepping inside. The air was colder than the morning should have allowed. The hearth was dead, the coals gray, yet the faint smell of smoke clung to the room like something that didn't want to leave. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Nothing looked broken or ransacked, but something was off. The chairs were slightly turned. The rug rippled as if dragged by a boot or a hand, and near the parlor door, The pie she'd brought days ago still sat untouched, now shrouded in mold. "Jed," she whispered. Her voice barely reached the far wall, then she saw it, the cloth crumpled on the floor like a shed skin. A terrible certainty settled in her chest. She crossed the room, every step slow, fighting the pull of her own dread. The box lay open on the table, or rather, what she had thought was a box. Now she could see it clearly for the first time. An oval mirror framed in black oak so dark it reflected no light at all. It gleamed faintly, not with brightness but with depth, as though it was filled with water that led down into nowhere. Her breath caught. Inside the glass a figure moved. It was Jed, or something that wore his face. He was standing, or floating, behind the surface, his palms pressed flat against it. His mouth opened, but no sound came through. The reflection of the room shimmered faintly around him, warped by a slow, liquid motion. His eyes, God help her, his eyes looked straight at her. Martha staggered backward, one hand to her chest. The whisper came then, faint as the rustle of a dry leaf. "Put it back." The voice wasn't Jed's. It was older, stretched thin with age and pain, and yet it filled the air around her. She bent down, hands trembling, and snatched up the black cloth. The fabric was cold, so cold that it burned. She threw it over the mirror, and for a moment the sound of wind rushed through the house like a breath being released. The air grew warmer, the light shifted, and the heavy stillness lifted as though the house had exhaled. When she dared to look again, the mirror's outline was barely visible beneath the cloth. The room was ordinary once more, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something watched her from underneath that fabric, waiting for her to falter. Martha backed away, one careful step at a time, until she stood in the doorway. Her voice quavered. "I told you not to look, boy," she murmured, though the man who disobeyed was far beyond hearing. She left the house as the sun broke over the hills. Behind her, the front door creaked closed on its own, the latch sliding into place with a hollow click. For a long while afterward, the Turner ranch stood silent again. The wind moved across the grass, carrying no whispers, no tapping, no voices, but every now and then, travelers riding past after sundown swore, they heard a sound from within, faint and desperate, the voice of a man lost behind glass, calling through the dark, "Don't take the cloth off." And though no one ever stayed long enough to see for themselves, the locals said that on cold nights, when the moon hung low over Dry Creek, a single window in the parlor glowed from within, dim, wavering, and shaped like an eye that never blinked.